cough. Please
Yeah. Oh,
forgive me, please.
no
So,
problem.
yeah.
I've just started recording, so, and I'll share this recording link with you because I know that you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because I'll let everyone at the Patreon know
yeah,
about it,
yeah,
obviously. So, yeah.
fantastic. Uh, okay, we just if someone can admit the people in, that's going to be the annoying thing. We had about 90 people accepted the invite,
Mm.
so which is really good going for us, and I'm not going to get distracted by that. So it's so easy to be distracted by trying to do three things at once. So uh, hello everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Eleanor Janega.
Yeah, you got it in
Okay,
one.
oh,
Wow.
good. Who is a medieval historian, author of one of my favorite books, of the Middle Ages, a graphic history, plus others. And if you're on her Patreon, then you will have received this 35-page document a few days ago, which was I'm still reading it at the moment. It's pretty incredible, but it does highlight, I think, the medieval church had some good things going for it. I think,
Yeah, it really did, actually.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
Eleanor is also co-host of the hit podcast Gone Medieval, which I thoroughly recommend. And gosh, and you're also on history hit TV.
Hmm.
You do various other public engagement works, and so you're always welcome to talk to us. One final thing before we get started, please remember we are funded through being as a through the SPARTA, and we're also funded by donations. And we've got a lot planned for next year, but we can only achieve it if people donate. So I'll just put that on there. And Eleanor, over to you.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Robert, for having me, because I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects. And indeed, this is going to be the subject of my next upcoming book, although I'm not going to focus solely on the medieval period in it. It's going to be a bit of a time spanner. But I thought I would talk to you a little bit about medieval ghosts today. And more particularly, I think that it is a great time of year to speak about medieval ghosts because it's the traditional time of year to think about ghosts. I think now we tend to associate ghosts more often with October and with Halloween, but this is a more modern construct. Whereas in the medieval period, December very much is a time of year where people begin to think about ghosts and think about death more often because Advent in the medieval context isn't sort of the holly jolly playing Last Christmas repeatedly and going out drinking with your mates time of year. It is a time when you are meant to be thinking about the apocalypse, in fact, because the idea here is that on Christmas Day, when Christmas begins and Jesus comes around, that is going to be like the rebirth of the world. And so you reflect on the fact that as it's getting darker and colder, that someday the world is going to end. And as a part of this, people often focus rather a lot on death. So when Robert said that I could come along in December, I immediately leapt to talking about ghosts. But let's just back up very quickly to say what I mean when we're talking about medieval ghosts. And stop me if you've heard this one before, but we do have to define the medieval period. And if we are talking about the medieval period, another way of saying this is the Middle Ages. And we call them the Middle Ages because they are situated halfway between the ancient period and our modern world. And that is very, very useful for us because it has a way of having direct links to both these periods. And that is a nice way to see ourselves reflected. So we can say that the medieval period, we generally, in terms of the European context, say that it starts after 476 with the so-called fall of Western Rome, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed. And then, when does it end? That's a good question. Um, what I usually say is if you see Protestants, you've gone too far. So something before 1517, and then that is how you know that you're in the medieval period. So when I'm going to be talking about ghosts today, these are sort of the parameters that I mean. I don't I'm not going to be able to trip any longer than that. I mean, it's only 45 minutes. I could keep you here all day whilst I rant. But this is a really fruitful place to go have a look for ideas of death and ideas about ghosts. But in order to do that, I have to talk to you about the ancient world. It's impossible not to. Um, and that is because medieval people really see themselves.
That everyone just got.
Medieval people really see
Because
themselves.
I don't get that much. I got like 20 quid.
I'm sorry, I think I'm just getting a little bit of audio from somebody bleeding through. Is that just me? Okay,
There is a voice. See if I can remind people to mute themselves. And thank you.
Thank you, my love. Sorry, I just don't want to talk over anyone else. So we have to start by thinking about ancient conceptions of ghosts because medieval people very much see themselves as in a direct line of heritage from the ancient world. And to an extent as well, they see themselves as in conjunction with it and continuing it on. And there are ancient conceptions of ghosts, very, very much so. Indeed, the oldest literature that we have, the oldest piece of writing is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the oldest piece of the Epic of Gilgamesh that exists to us is a ghost story, which is called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Underworld. And Romans and Greeks have all kinds of wonderful ghost stories as well. And what we are given to understand from the ancient world is that ghosts exist and they are possible. So, people tell ghost stories all the time. People tell ghost stories for all kinds of different reasons, and we have lots of surviving ancient ghost stories that tell us all about what ghosts showed up and why, which do all kinds of wonderful and interesting things that I don't have time to get into with you today. But ancient Greeks talked about them, ancient Babylonians talk about them, and ancient Romans talk about them pretty much continuously. And what these ghost stories often do, not always, but often, is they reinforce the fact that there is an afterlife that you can't really come back from. Ghosts often show up to tell you all about the afterlife, what's going on in the underworld, things like that, but they always have to return to it. And this is an image that kind of talks about one of these very famous ghost stories. So this is Orpheus and Eurydice. I'm sure you've probably heard about this. They're in love. There are varying versions, but Eurydice often is said to have died on her wedding day. Orpheus, heartbroken, sort of gets a pass to go down into Hades and try to bring her back to life. But the catch is that he can't look at her until he reaches the regular world again. But then at the last moment, he turns around and sees her, and then she retreats back into the underworld. So it basically is used to reiterate the idea that even if you get a special pass from the gods, it's almost impossible to bring people back. So when people are dead, they're dead. Now, those people can communicate with you. You can go find them in the underworld. They might come up from the underworld and have a bit of a walk around and tell you some stories. But the fact is, they are dead. And so it is one of these things where we understand the condition of being alive by contrasting it with the dead in the ancient world. And ancient people very much tell these stories and think about them as a part of life. But this begins to change with the Christian turn. So when everyone begins to Christianize, new ideas come in, okay? And very, very particularly, ghosts are not supposed to be possible within the Christian way of doing things. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that within Christian cosmology, fundamentally, when one is dead, one goes to one of two places, especially within early Christianity. You either go to hell or you go to heaven. That's it. Congratulations, right? So there's no way for ghosts to be walking around in the world because ghosts have a place to be. The dead have a place to go. You're either supposed to be suffering because you didn't live a good Christian life, or you're supposed to be celebrating because you did. And so congratulations to everybody. You are in heaven now. Wonderful. Great stuff. We love to see it. But also another thing that this is doing is not just saying there's a place that you go when you're dead. There are certain things that happen when you're dead. It's differentiating Christians from their pagan counterparts within Rome. Because what you're doing when you're creating a new religion in these circumstances is you are saying we're not like them. You have to have your unique selling point. What is it about you as the Christian religion that makes you different to the pagans all around you. And one of the things that they say is that there's this organized way of dealing with the dead, and it can maybe be comforting. You don't need to worry about if your ancestors who are dead are going to get up and have a bit of a walk around and come visit you in the middle of the night, because they are not going to be able to do that fundamentally. So it can be also seen just as a differentiation point, a way to say this is what Christianity means and these are our ideals. And indeed, St. Augustine writes on this. So St. Augustine of Hippo is generally considered one of the so-called church fathers. So he, along with individuals like St. Jerome, are the people who really sit down and write out the theological rules for what Christianity is going to be. What does it mean to be within communion of the Christian church? Because, they were kind of operating on vibes and gospels earlier on. They were a very persecuted religion. And so there wasn't necessarily a set of rules that had happened yet, because it just takes a while to get these things done. So by the time that you are no longer persecuted for being a Christian, you have people who need to come in and write these things down. And St. Augustine writes about ghosts, talking to people, that he emphatically does not think that the soul leaves the body with a material body. And this is key for the way that people tend to think and talk about ghosts. So their point being that a soul is not going to be able to appear to you because you can't see a soul. So it's going to have some form of material body if you're seeing somebody after they're dead. And you can't have that because the soul escapes and it goes wherever it is meant to go. And this kind of sets up a really quick and easy bifurcation of religions. So pagans think that it might be possible for dead people to show up and have a bit of a walk around and rattle chains. There's rather a lot of rattling of chains that goes on, and things of this nature. But St. Augustine says that that can't be possible within this particularized cosmology. But there are ways of getting around this, because people still report having real connections with dead people. So he has, for example, a conversation with his counterpart Gennadius, who writes about the fact that he has a visitation multiple times in his sleep from a young man who takes him to the afterlife and shows him heaven and shows him hell. And this dead young man who shows him these things while he's asleep says to him at one point, "As those eyes of flesh are now inactive and perform no function while your body lies asleep in bed, yet you have eyes with which you behold me, and a sight of which you make use. So when you die, and the eyes of your flesh see nothing, there will be in you another life by which you will live and sense by wonder which you perceive. See to it that thenceforth you do not doubt of the life which remains after death." So what is this doing here? It's saying that it is possible, just in the way that one dreams, and one doesn't have one's eyes open but perceives pictures or images to exist. There's a similar experience when one is dead. So the soul is basically able to make use of the same facilities of a body, but after death, right? And so this is a kind of like all right use of a dead person, because the person has come to say, oh, look, I'm showing you heaven, I'm showing you hell, I'm showing you these good Christian things. And because you're asleep, it's okay to see the dead person because you're just having a dream. No one is saying that the ghost showed up in your room and he had a lot of things to say to you, and then you shook his hand and it went separate ways. This is sort of an acceptable way within the Christian imagination to sort ghosts and relate to ghosts. So St. Augustine takes this on board, and what he has to say about this is, every day man wakes and sleeps and thinks. Let him say whence come those thoughts resembling the shapes, the qualities, and the motions of bodies, yet not composed of corporeal matter. Let him say it, if he can, but if he cannot, why does he rashly try to form some kind of definitive opinion about these very rare and unusual experiences, when he cannot explain the constant and daily ones? As for me, words fail me to explain how those seemingly material bodies without a real body are produced. yet, as I know that they are not produced by the body, so I wish I could know how we perceive those things which are seen sometimes by the spirit, and are thought to be seen by the body, or how we are to distinguish the visions of those who are deluded by error or impiety, when they are generally described in the same terms as the visions of the good and the holy. So basically, what he's saying is that people might think that they are seeing ghosts, but that is just a vision akin to a dream. So if you think you see a ghost, maybe you have seen something, but you perceived it spiritually. You haven't perceived it with your actual eyes. You see it with the spiritual eyes. And you can have visitations from ghosts in your sleep. And indeed, we begin to see rather a lot of this in the late antique Christian context. So, for example, we will have reports from various Christian noble people, especially women, that they've had a dream about their dead husbands. So there's a quite famous dream ghost story where a noblewoman whose husband died before her appears to her as a ghost, and he is being tortured because he had a child out of wedlock who died in infancy and was never baptized. And so his punishment is that the baby is constantly wrapped around his leg, screaming and weeping because it never received baptism. And this is a ghost story which works because she's having it while she's asleep, and it's reinforcing an important Christian moral method, which is that one ought not to have children outside of wedlock, and one ought to baptize their children. And so she's just kind of saying, oh, well, here's some Christian things that I am doing and experiencing, but I'm doing it in my sleep. This isn't something that I'm saying, oh yeah, my husband showed up and I had this particular epiphany with his ghost. She's saying I dreamed these things. And then that comes under the umbrella of visions. And Christians were rather fond of having visions, especially in the late antique and medieval periods. They have visions that show them all sorts of things. So visions of heaven, visions of hell, visions of demons, visions of holiness, you name it, they're having it. And so this is an absolutely fine use of the Christian experience to sort out experiences of the dead. Now, you and I might say, okay, well, you're just having a dream about a ghost. And they're like, yes, that's fine, but the dream is what makes it acceptable. So then we get into the medieval period. And the thing is, a couple hundred years down the road, people just stop caring quite as much about the whole you're not supposed to be able to see ghosts thing. And we start to get ghosts crop back up. Now, the thing is, especially about this period, in the earlier medieval period, we don't have a great number of sources because 1400 years is a really long time ago. And it's very, very difficult to just kind of keep sources around the shop. So as a result, we end up hearing very particularly from people like St. Augustine, who I've already met, or, these noble women, really high up people, because they're the sorts of people whose writings are kept. No one is keeping the writings of the local washerwoman, even if she can read and write, because she's not particularly possible. But it's people like saints, like popes, whose words get written down. And one example of these is St. Gregory the Great. St. Gregory the Great, as the name implies, is a saint, and he was also the pope at the time. And he writes down this ghost story himself in one of his own works, which he says has been reported to him by a certain Bishop Felix. And Bishop Felix used to go to the hot springs of Toriana whenever his health required. Common. So everybody bathes in the medieval period. I've already yelled at you about that, but I'm not going to stop. But you will go to the hot springs or something like that if you're also under the weather. So I would be there right now if I could be, but hey ho. So he says, one day as he entered the baths, he found a stranger there who showed himself most helpful in every way possible by unlatching his shoes, taking care of his clothes, and furnishing him towels after the hot bath. And he goes repeatedly to Toriana, and this guy just continues to be there over and over again. He's always there with a towel. He's always there helping out Felix. And he's just super, super, helpful, and not to say obsequious, but he's certainly there. And eventually Felix says to himself, oh, this servant has been incredibly helpful. And what I am going to do is I'm going to bring him like the equivalent of a tip, because what a nice guy to help me out so much. And so the next time he goes, he brings to him some bread, which is a nice thing to do. And it says, when the priest was again fully dressed and ready to live, he offered the man the present of bread, asking him kindly to accept it as a blessing, for it was offered a token of charity. But the man sighed mournfully and said, why do you give it to me, father? That bread is holy, and I cannot eat it. I who stand before you was once the owner of this place. It is because of my sins that I was sent back here as a servant. If you wish to do something for me, then offer this bread to Almighty God, and so make intercession for me, a sinner. When you come back and do not find me here, you will know that my prayers have been heard. So, it's a ghost! And this is very, very interesting, right? Because this is not a dream ghost, like St. Augustine says is fine and acceptable. This ghost is physical. This ghost can help you unlatch your shoes. This ghost can hand you a towel. The only reason we know he's a ghost now is because he's not allowed to eat holy bread because he's in trouble. And that's why he's haunting this bathhouse. So here we have an actual corporeal ghost that is just hanging out, haunting a bathhouse, and he's waiting for intercession as a result of his sins. So the bishop then goes, like, spoiler alert, Bishop Felix is a nice guy. He goes and says a bunch of masses for him, and the ghost goes away and isn't in the bathhouse anymore. And this becomes a really common way of relating to ghosts. Ghosts show up because something has gone wrong for them and they are not in heaven. Because if you're in heaven, why are you going to bother? Like, you're not going to go bother people on earth. You're too busy being in the presence of God. You show up on earth because you've done something wrong and you need help getting out of hell. And so here is this particular ghost who's like, I know what I'll do. I'll suck up to the bishop. And the bishop then can get me out of trouble for the things that I've done in life. And this becomes a very, very common motif, especially in early medieval ghost stories. There's often ghosts in bathhouses. So, for example, we have one wherein a very high up nobleman who had backed the wrong candidate for pope. It was, one of those times when there were sort of two popes, which was rather the style in the early medieval period. And he'd sort of backed the wrong candidate and then died. And then he is found in a bathhouse, hanging out in the bathhouse. And he's being punished because he backed the wrong candidate for pope. And then eventually one of the cardinals prays for him and he is able to go to heaven. But these things are kind of then serving a very specific function, right? They're saying, you might see dead people because dead people have messed up. And here is the ways that you might have messed up. And for that person, he was politically on the wrong side of things. So this is a warning. Don't back the wrong candidate for pope. If your guy doesn't get elected, you need to immediately back down from that, or you're going to end up in a bathhouse haunting it, right? So we don't know exactly the Bishop Felix ghost sins, that he doesn't enumerate on them, but we do know that you can end up as a ghost in these ways, serving very particularly, and very particularly serving in bathhouses, because what the bathhouse is kind of doing, because it's hot, it's steamy, it's showing us it's kind of like hell. Excuse me, sorry. That's the cold. All right. Send me to the bathhouse, people. So basically, the bathhouse here is a stand-in for hell. Lovely. I'm just going to try to compose myself. I'm sorry. Not perfect. Okay. So as the medieval period goes forward, we then have a new invention, which is the concept of purgatory. And in the medieval context, purgatory, it's a bit different from the way that we think about it now. It's not a neutral third space that people go if they haven't been exactly perfect. It is kind of hell with a timer. So the idea here is that you get sent to purgatory, you get sent to hell, but what you're going to do is you're going to burn off your sins. You're going to be punished for the time being, And then that's going to allow you to expiate your sins, and then you can go to heaven. Great, wonderful thing, right? So, this then begins to make a little bit more sense with ghosts in the period. So, Jacques Legoff, the famous historian, says purgatory in the medieval period imprisons ghosts. So, you will then hear about ghosts because they've kind of like wiggled their way out of this particularized circumstance. They are suffering. That's the thing about ghosts. Is these ghosts, like the Bishop Felix ghost, he's suffering and he's saying, I don't want to be in this bathhouse anymore. I want to move on. But the suffering will kind of ramp up. It's not just that you're a servant stuck in a hot place, eventually later in the period. It's more like you are experiencing the torments of hell and you want to get out of them. And there will be an increased emphasis on the torments as time goes by. So, we get, as a result of this, a brand new form of ghost story, which is first brought to our attention by Odoric Vitalis, who is a cleric and someone who writes history. And he has written a certain work called the Ecclesiastical History. And from 1091, he reports as part of it a miraculous haunting, which becomes a literature motif that we now call a harlequin haunt or a hell hunt. And this is big in medieval literature, and it's kind of like the form of ghost story that you will see repeatedly all the time over and over and over. And he repeats that there is a certain priest called Volashellen, great name, bring it back, who was off seeing to some sick people, saying mass for them, and late at night, he's going back along the road. And he suddenly hears like a big retinue of people coming, and he assumes it's the local lord. He decides he's just gonna like, sorry, duck off the road out of sight, and he is going to let this big retinue pass. Because, you know, you're one person, you don't want to get in the way of a lord. Also, the lord is currently fighting with the king, so you just don't want to get like caught up in all that. So he ducks off the road. But instead of seeing the local lord's retinue come past, he instead sees a bunch of monsters. And he says that he sees a man of huge stature carrying a great mace who bars the priest's way as he ran, because, you know, he runs when he sees all the monsters. And brandishing the weapon over his head, he cried out, "Stand, go no further." The priest obeyed at once and stood motionless, leaning on the staff he was carrying. The stern mace bearer stood beside him without harming him, waiting for the army to pass by. Next followed a great army of knights in which no color was visible, save blackness and flickering fire. All rode upon huge horses, fully armed as they were galloping to battle and carrying jet black standards. On the biers sat men as small as dwarfs, with huge heads like barrels. One enormous tree trunk was borne by two Ethiopians, and on the trunk some wretch, tightly trussed, was suffering tortures, screaming aloud in his dreadful agony. A fearful demon sitting on the same trunk was mercilessly goading his back and loins with red-hot spurs, while he streamed with blood. Volshan at once recognized him as the slayer of the priest Stephen, and realized that he was suffering unbearable torments for his guilt in shedding innocent blood not 2 years earlier, for he had died without completing his penance for the terrible crime. Okay, so we're going to pause. What is happening within these Harlequin haunts is often the same thing that we see in hell scenes, one of which I have up on the screen here. This is from the Cathedral of Bologna, wherein we begin to see ironic tortures happening. And ironic tortures are very, very big for medieval people. So they act as sort of mirrors for the present world. So saying if you do X crime or you do a X bad thing, you're going to experience a torture in hell similar. So we have a knight who has killed an innocent priest. So his torture is that he's not riding a horse. Some of these knights are riding fully armed and galloping, right? But he's not riding on a horse. He's riding on a log. So this is kind of like a demotion. It's a come down in the world. It's that he's not on an actual horse. He's being made to ride something else, something inanimate. So that's ironic. And also, he is being ridden. So he is being ridden by these demons who are wearing red hot spurs and who are riding him as though he were a horse. And this is about saying that people who have the power to kill, which is knights and the nobility, and they do, by and large, you are probably not going to get in very much trouble if you're a member of the nobility and you decide that you want to kill someone who's not important. It's just not going to happen for you. Now, you will though experience punishments for that. So he didn't do penance. He didn't like really have anything happen, and so he just died. And so now he's being tortured, and he is experiencing something that is ironic for his position, and he's feeling pain, and he's feeling torture in these particular ways. But the Harlequin haunt just doesn't have that one torture. It's got all sorts of them. So you see this army of great knights who came in before, and he says no color is visible, and they're just on flickering fire. And so this is meant to show these are all people who are members of the nobility, and it no longer matters who your house is. I can't see your standard. All of your worldly obsession with your own house and with your colors and all these things, that is going to go away after you're dead. And also they're experiencing a torture, which is this fire. But there is a similar Harlequin haunt that has a really important message for the nobility as well. And it comes to us from William of Glaus. And he sees a similar Harlequin haunt because it just becomes fashionable. That's the haunting you're going to see after this. And in it, he sees a named knight who approaches him and says, "My usury torments me, for I lent my money to a poor man receiving a mill of his as a pledge. And because he was unable to repay the loan, I retained the pledge all of my life and disinherited the legitimate heir by leaving it to my heirs. See, I carry a burning mill shaft in my mouth, which, believe me, seems heavier than the castle of Rouen. Therefore, tell my wife Beatrice and my son Roger that they must help me by quickly restoring the heir to the pledge, from which they have received far more than I ever gave." This is a really, really big sin in the medieval period, usury. So lending money at interest. You're not supposed to be doing that. It's something that Jesus speaks about really extensively, and it is a bad way of making money. And here it is highlighted why this is a problem. And it's because he got the money back that he lent many times over, but he kept the mill anyway, and his family's still making money off of it, even though they never... they're making way more money than they ever paid for it. So, in order to get out of this predicament, the mill needs to go back to what the rightful owner should be, which is the miller's son. So here we're asking for intercession from William of Glaus to set this right, because otherwise he's going to keep experiencing this torture. So, again, we have this ironic punishment. We've got this burning mill shaft in his mouth. And it is his way of trying to directly intercede, and not all of the ghosts that he sees in the Harlequin haunt do speak to him. But this is one where there's a pretty expedient remedy here. It's like the pain is still ongoing for this ghost because the wrong is still ongoing. These people are still disinherited, and the powerful have usurped their position, right? The powerful have taken from the disempowered. And so you tell these stories in order to try to keep the nobility in line, just to try to nip them into a little bit of shape, because this is like seriously problematic stuff. And we see rather a lot of interesting variations on this in the Byland Abbey ghost stories. And the Byland Abbey ghost stories are famous as medieval ghost stories go. Sorry. They are attached to the Byland Abbey, which is up in Yorkshire. It was a Cistercian monastery, which is important here, because Cistercians, their deal is that they are like academics. So Cistercians are super, super involved in copying out, classical works, a lot of Plato, rather a lot of Aristotle, things of this nature. But we find the Byland Abbey ghost stories that were on the blank pages of a big manuscript book that has all the kind of common Cistercian things in it. It's got Cicero in it. It's got Plato. There's a bunch of theological stuff. And it's at the British Library. It's a Royal MS 15AXX. And so we find these series of ghost stories there where basically there's some leftover pages, and one of the monks is like, I am going to tell you all about the local hauntings we have here in Yorkshire. And he writes down a series of ghost stories. I think there's 12 in total. Um, we don't have time. I could just do the Bylam ghost stories, but we're not going to do that today. But the most famous one and the longest one is the story of Snowball the Tailor and the Ghost, this is the manuscript here. If you were listening in on Roger and I geeking out earlier, this is what you have to read if you're a medievalist. If it's not printed, this is what you have to deal with in terms of source material. So Snowball is once again walking home late at night. That is a common occurrence within where you see ghost stories. They often take place outside. Gosh, I'm so sorry. They often take place outside. They often take place when the person is alone. And it's usually at night. And the ghost first approaches Snowball in a number of manners. So first he's a raven that's breathing fire, and then he's a dog and all of these things. And eventually Snowball abjures him by the name of Christ and Christ's wounds. And he then finally appears in the shape of a man. And we find out why he's appearing as a ghost to Snowball. And he says, thus and thus I did. And for thus doing, I have been excommunicated. So basically, there is some elaboration of his sins, but they don't write it down. He did something bad, okay? And he ended up getting excommunicated for it as a result. So that's why he's a ghost now. And he says, go therefore to a certain priest and ask him to absolve me. And it behooves me to have the full number of 9 times 20 masses celebrated for me. And now of 2 things you must to choose one. Either you shall come back to me on a certain night alone, bringing to me the answer of those whose names I have given you, and I will tell you how you may be made whole. So, Snowball does this, and Snowball goes down to York as a result of this. Well, first he gets really, really ill because he's so shocked by the ghost. But then when he recovers, he goes down to York. And he goes to York to do this very specifically because since he's got so many masses that need to be said, he just goes to every single one of the convents around there and every single one of the masses and says, yo, we need these said. I'm getting tortured by a ghost. He's in hell. You got to get him out of there. He's been excommunicated, so please go do this for me. And so he goes around to each of the houses, and it just means that it happens faster. He also ends up getting a written pardon for the man's excommunication written on a piece of parchment, which he then goes and buries at the man's grave. So he's back in communion with the church, even though he's dead, and he's having all of these masses said for his soul. So he goes back to meet said ghost, and he does all kinds of interesting things. He makes a magic circle to protect himself. He brings copies of the Gospels. He does like all of this stuff, right? And the ghost is like, well done, mate. You did it. He says, know moreover that I have met you now because today that the ghost is very, very happy because the ghost does get to get out of hell. But he makes it clear to Snowball that the reason that he'd met him in the first place is that he hadn't been to Mass that day. He says, know moreover that I met you now because today you have not heard Mass nor the Gospel of John and have not seen the consecration of our Lord's body and blood, and otherwise I should not have had the full power of appearing to you. So, it's not just that the ghost did something wrong. Snowball himself had kind of done something wrong, right? So you have to be in a morally ambiguous place in order for a ghost to be able to appear to you. Because if you were fully like up to date with all of your masses, it's like an inoculation, right? It's like, this is the thing that is boosting your morality to the point that you don't have to worry that something terrible can show up to you because God would be protecting you. By simply seeing the consecration of the Eucharist, you're good to go. And that kind of like keeps you safe. So we then learn a lot about morality generally here, is that this is something that is ongoing both for ghosts and the people involved. And you can't get haunted if you're holy enough, and Snowball wasn't holy enough. But, Snowball gets off the hook because he does all the right things by this ghost. So here we go with another one of these ghosts that is just trying to do a very specific religious thing. and doing it pretty well, right? But then, kind of to wrap up, I wanted to talk about a counterpoint to that, which is the ghost story of my boy, the Emperor Charles IV. Emperor Charles IV, he's my favorite ruler. And he was the king of Bohemia from 1346 to 1378, and the Holy Roman Emperor from 1355 to 1378. Wonderful, great stuff. As a part of this, though, he writes an autobiography. And he writes an autobiography for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, because he was the kind of second of a new dynasty that had been established in Bohemia. And his father was really hated because his father sucked. So he was trying to prove his Czechness to his fellow Bohemians when he came to the throne. He's like, oh yeah, like I'm a big Czech guy. Here's all these things. You know, remember my mom? I'm just like her. Similarly, he writes a lot about his time in the Italian lands and, you know, kind of like marching up and down all through the Holy Roman Empire to show that he is a good emperor and that he understands the needs of the people more generally. But he's also a super religious guy, so he reports what he says are religious miracles, things of this nature. So it's really an autobiography, like all autobiographies, that is setting out to position Charles IV as kind of a trustworthy guy. And in this, that's all well and good. It's very dry. I do not suggest that you go out and read the Emperor Charles IV's autobiography. That's for nerds like me. But I was absolutely fascinated when I read it, because I then came across a ghost story. And in the middle of his very, very dry, dull talk about where he's been on possession to, what battle he's going to do, he writes this. We arrived at a late hour at the Castle of Prague at the old house of the Burgrave, where he had lived for several years before the great palace had been built. When night came, we went to our bed, and Bushko of Walharnitz Sr. was in another room in front of us. There was a great fire in the room because it was wintertime, and there were many candles burning too, so that it was quite light. All the doors and windows were closed. So he is setting up the fact that this is a closed room, it's bright, he can see well, and there's not going to be a breeze that could explain what happens next. When we had just fallen asleep, something moved about in the room and we both awoke. We had Bushko get up to see what it was. He got up and went around the room searching, but saw nothing and was able to find nothing. Then he built up the fire, lit more candles, and went to the cups which stood full of wine on the benches and drank from them, and put one cup near one of the great burning candles. Having drunk, he lay down again on his bed. We sat upright in bed, covered by our blankets, and heard someone walking about, but were not able to see anyone. And while we were looking with Bushko at the cups and the candles, we saw a cup thrown. It was thrown, we did not know by whom, over Bushko's bed from one end of the room to the far wall. It bounced off, and it fell in the middle of the room. Seeing this, we were terribly afraid. We could still hear someone continuing to move about, but we saw no one. After making the sign of the cross in Christ's name, we slept until morning. Getting up in the morning, we found the cup which had been thrown into the middle of the room, and we showed it to all of our servants when they had come to us in the morning. So, I am really obsessed with this ghost story because it sounds exactly like the sort of ghost story you would hear in a modern context now. This is a classic discussion that you could hear any of the time. We have him saying, it's bright. We were awake. We both experienced this. There's no way that a cup could have gone up. Okay, sure, maybe we're imagining things that we hear somebody walking around the room, but how do you explain the fact that this cup moved when no one else was in the room? We have candles lit. We have fires lit. We are expressly looking for this. And we have this weird ghost who just comes and chucks a cup across the room and freaks us out. And then they do, the classic Catholic thing here. They're making the sign of the cross. And then eventually when they do that, they're able to sleep. And I really like this ghost story because it doesn't adhere to the same sorts of rules of all the ones that we've heard up until this point. All of the ghost stories that I've kind of repeated to you were all good moral Christian lessons. They're about ghosts that have appeared from purgatory, ghosts that have appeared from hell, to ask you for help and intercession because they lived sinful lives, right? This doesn't do that at all. This is completely nonsensical. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any kind of moral lesson at all whatsoever. And we get it because we have an individual, and granted he's an incredibly powerful individual, one of the most powerful individuals to ever live, but he's just telling you the story of his life. And for him, this ghost story is one of the most important things that ever happened. So he commits it to the page. And people don't really know what to do with this. I looked really hard, but I couldn't find an example online for it, but I've seen it in pictures. Oftentimes, when you find medieval manuscripts of Charles IV's autobiography, if they illustrate this scene, they illustrate it showing Charles asleep. Because even though Charles very specifically says, I wasn't asleep, I woke up and so did Bushko. This is something that happened to us both. But they can't handle it because it doesn't have a moral story. It doesn't have any kind of way to learn about Christianity. So as a result, Charles has to be put to sleep in pictures, even if that's not what he says is happening, because otherwise there's no way to make it fit within the Christian cosmology. And I think this is really important because it shows us how sources work. Because if we don't hear from very many people, we're only going to hear from the rich and the powerful who are going to tell us what they want us to know, right? And they're going to give us the moral lessons that they want. And Charles IV is just out here doing his thing, and so we hear something completely different. So what does this all mean? First of all, what this is very, very good at telling us is that there's some kind of deep human need to know that ghosts exist. Ghosts appear even when they're not supposed to. St. Augustine doesn't want ghosts appearing to you. St. Augustine doesn't want you to think that there is a world in which that can happen. And yet, humans are still coming up with big ghost stories. They're still telling each other stories about things that they've seen, strange stuff that's going on. But because we only have so many sources from the period, the sources with the ghosts are going to reflect the social expectations of the people who are writing them. So because we're mostly hearing from religious men, we're mostly hearing from monks and priests, what is going to happen there is that they're going to tell us a story about Christianity. They're going to tell us that ghosts are here to tell you that if you are not a good Christian, then you are going to go to hell. Surprise. And then the way that you get people out of hell, the way you get them out of purgatory is by having masses said for them. But there's a financial aspect to this too, because those masses aren't free. When Snowball the tailor goes around York getting masses said, he has to pay for all of those things. So it's also kind of like an infomercial on the part of the church who are saying, if you have ghost trouble, you need to intercede, and this is how you'll get rid of the ghost, but it's going to cost you because you need to have masses said for their soul. Similarly, if you're worried, if your husband is a knight and he's kind of a jerk and he stole somebody's mill, you better start paying out immediately. You better start having lots of masses said for his soul. If you know that they are doing bad things, you need to make sure that this money is going to the right place. Having said that, there are outliers, like Charles IV's ghost story. So we can only get these outlying stories that don't make any sense, that don't have a narrative context. They're just a weird ghost story when we can hear from individuals. And when we hear from individuals who are not writing for a very specific purpose, then we get common ghost stories, the sort of thing that you would hear now, right? And this is kind of one of those functions of the past and functions of source survival more generally. We don't get to hear from regular people. They're not literate. Their things don't get written down. So we hear more ghost stories now that are like Charles IV because we can hear from normal people, because normal people are now literate. So we have all these ways to communicate strange things that don't make any sense. So the moral of the story here is that ghosts can be used by the powerful and often are used by the powerful, but the ghosts also defy them. So ghosts also show up to say, you shouldn't take from the poor, you shouldn't kill people indiscriminately, you should live a theoretically good life. So they both reinforce the social hierarchy, but then also the expectations of how one ought to behave between that, unless you have a weird little guy who's going to throw a cup across the room. So that's a quick tour of medieval ghosts. Do you have any questions?
Well, firstly, Eleanor, well done for getting through that. I must.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
No, I felt for you. Hopefully, everyone will show their appreciation in the usual way, either virtually clapping. Yes, we got a few virtual claps. So if you've got time for questions, we've got some in the chat. it might be easier if you just look in the chat and answer
Yeah,
it that
absolutely.
way.
Let's go have a look. Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay. Okay, so ghosts. Okay, first one, ghosts. It is thought not confirmed under certain environmental conditions could be in buildings, like they could capture real images like cameras. This is the stone tape theory. And when those environmental occasions happen in the future, those fake recordings are replayed. So perhaps that's why people claim to see ghosts. So the stone tape theory. I find this one quite compelling, and I'm going to give you my own pet theory of ghosts now, which is based on the way that we think about medieval things. I think about medieval things more generally, right? So what I always say is that in the medieval period, oftentimes things were thought to be magic when you couldn't explain them. So magnets are magic because they don't quite understand how they work, but they know that they work. They see that they work. Electric eels are magic because, they're conducting electricity, and that's wild, right? And they can't explain how that happens, and they'll just say, well, I don't know, that's magic, right? And I think a good way of talking about ghosts is to say, all right, well, this is this thing that we can't necessarily explain yet. And it's just that we can't explain it yet. We now know that atoms can exist in more than one place at the same time. So that is a scientific fact. So perhaps it has something to do with that. And yeah, maybe this is just kind of like things that kind of get trapped in a building or trapped in certain ways and it just echoes, and we just don't know how to do it yet. But because humans are humans, what our brains want to do is pattern recognition. So they want to kind of like put meaning onto things when there isn't necessarily meaning. And that's why I like Charles IV's ghost story, because it doesn't have any meaning. It's just a weird story, And I think that those are my favorite kind of ghost stories, the ones that have like that have no real background behind them. They just kind of exist, right? Okay, reincarnation, which is never been proved. So within the Christian cosmology, you can't have it. So, medieval people are like, no. Medieval Europeans, they say that you can't have that. Obviously in traditions where there is like reincarnation, there's all kinds of stories that will come to us out of, for example, the Tibetan tradition about how they find like, the Panchen Lama again or the Dalai Lama again. And the signs of how they find them. But I think that's a little bit different to ghosts, because whilst it does involve the spirit, the fundamental difference between a ghost and reincarnation is that a ghost can't come back. The ghost is dead. So it's in many ways reincarnation is kind of like the opposite of ghosts, if that makes sense, because you can't have that, right? So, okay, so yeah, I've definitely looked at the British Library records for ghosts. That's where the Byland Abbey ghost stories come from. This British Library manuscript. And we've got like some very. This is the most famous one. Do you have something like a kind of ones there? I have yet to make a new discovery of ghost stories yet. I would like to be in the manuscript reading room and find some new ones someday. That would be absolutely brilliant. But you can go to the British Library and read the Epic of Gilgamesh and get the oldest ghost story right now. That's no trouble at all. So there are new discoveries to be made all the time in manuscripts. It's just like, do you have enough time to read through them all?
And how about the kind of the all verbal tradition?
Well, that's the thing, right? So this is where folklore comes in, right? Because there are plenty of verbal traditions which are also, absolutely valid as ways of communicating. Granted, I am a historian, so I tend to work very specifically on written records, but folklorists and people like this, or people who do oral histories, they work with that sort of stuff all the time, and you get great ghost stories that way. So we have more of folk ghost stories begin to enter the record, more particularly in the early modern period, when people start going and talking to people and recording those ghost stories. So we have rather a lot of stuff from the 19th century, for example, because Victorians were really into that. Victorians love to simply go out to the Welsh countryside and ask about ghosts, And then you get a ton of them that come up, and they probably were around in the medieval period, because they'll say that this has always been the way that things are. But we don't get them recorded until the modern period. having said that, that doesn't make it not a valid source. It just means that you have to treat them kind of differently, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if the Westminster Library has anything on the ghosts here, but I suppose I should check it out, I guess. That's gonna be that's a good one. I'm like, that's a hot tip. Yeah, so okay, yeah, most encounters are outdoors. So was there a common setting or place they were tied to? Woods, graveyards, or churches? Yes, crossroads. So ghosts show up at crossroads very, very often. And similarly, we often have these particular motifs that happen where ghosts cannot cross running water. That will be a sort of thing. So, for example, there is one of the Island ghost stories where a ghost shows up, and he's a very bad ghost indeed. And he tries to make up for his sins by helping a peasant carry a big bag of beans. But he can only carry the big bag of beans as far as the nearest river because he can't go over the river. So, you know, these are things that we see reflected in folk belief very often. You know, this worry about running water and an inability to cross it. The showing up at crossroads, showing up on the road more generally. So yeah, sometimes these things will happen in woods. Woods also in the medieval imagination kind of function as a place of magic. So the woods, you know, that's like whenever you read Arthuriana, for example, you're forever running into a wizard out in the woods, right? Because it's not humanized, it isn't domesticated. So within that, you will often see ghosts kind of show up in those places. Graveyards and churches less so, although they will occasionally, we have the Revenant Dead, who I didn't have time to get into, will oftentimes show up in graveyards. And the Revenant Dead usually show up when some guy was a real jerk and he got like buried in the graveyard. And he's kind of getting up out of his grave usually to go cause a ruckus. And you sort out the Revenant Dead usually by going and chopping their heads off and then burying them not in the churchyard, usually in a kind of liminal space, like often submerged. So one of the Byland ghost stories has this. They've got a Revenant Dead guy who he was very rich, so he gets buried at Byland Abbey, and they dig him up and they drag him with some oxen over into a marsh. And then he stops haunting everyone.
Could I ask you about, I think it's, I'm a Winifred.
Mm-hmm.
Because
yeah, so St. Guifor, who is, he was a local saint in the French woods. And the church like kind of showed up and said, hey, do you guys have any local saints? Which was rather the done thing. One of the major ways that you would get saints in the medieval period was you would just go find out who people thought a saint was, and you would say, oh yeah, great, that's fine. But then this all kind of grinds to a halt because it turns out that St. Guifor is a greyhound that everybody has been worshiping. The story here being that a python sneaks into a knight's house. Then it's going to kill the baby in the crib, but the greyhound kills the python. But the knight hears the commotion and sees the cradle knocked over and sees blood and thinks that the dog has killed the baby, so he kills the dog. But then they realize, oh, the dog saved the baby. They then bury the dog in a well, and people start worshiping the dog as a saint at the well. And the church says, not only is this guy not a saint because he's a dog, but you're actually worshiping a demon now. And they say that there are like wolves in the woods that are demons that are showing up because of this localized practice. So that kind of puts paid to letting people do kind of local canonization for a while, because they're like, oh, you see what happens if you leave poor people to their own devices.
That's fantastic. I think you misheard me. I said I'm Winifred.
Oh,
a ghost?
Saint Winifred. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you get saintly ghosts. Yeah, so Saint Winifred shows up, and she's like she's lost her head, and it's about kind of like finding her head. And the saints show up as ghosts all the time. It's really interesting.
Right.
So, you know, she's like attempting to find her head, and she's kind of like reenacting this, which is quite a classical ghost thing. Over in Bohemia, you've got Saint Procopius. And St. Procopius shows up after his monastery, after he dies, is taken over by German monks, and his ghost very specifically scares them all and gets them to all leave. And he brings back Czech people. So you can be a ghost and a saint, but the saints can do it because they're doing a holy thing. So they're showing up to teach a moral lesson one way or another, but it's very interesting because they're still described as frightening. So people are still afraid of St. Winifred when she's showing up looking for her head, even though they know it's a saint, right? It's because it's very, very scary when someone without a head shows up, So, yeah.
I think we're running out of time. I noticed in the chat, Michael was asking about early Christian. Sorry, about is it the story in the Bible of?
Oh, the Witch of Endor. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is often, this is kind of the way that they deal with this, is that witches and things like that, when they are summoning up spirits, it's not a ghost, it's a soul. So, and you can do that. And there's like rather a lot of saying, stop trying to summon spirits to do things, which is necromancy. So like just asking dead people, all kinds of medieval people love to try to summon a dead person to ask where the spoons they lost are and things like this. It's very, very common. And you shouldn't do that. But that's not a ghost because you summoned them. So they've been brought up via magic and you're not supposed to do magic. And so that's the difference. They're not roaming around on their own, which is more of a ghost thing. They've been conjured. And that's kind of possible.
Right. Well, I think we'll end there because I want to save your throat and your
I'm so sorry, everyone. That was absolutely disgusting.
No, yeah. After what you've been through, I only wish you all the best for the remainder of the year. I know you're going away, and you're going to be in Australia next week. I think. So,
I am. Yeah.
So all the very best, and we'd love to have you back in the future. So everyone, let's show our appreciation to Eleanor and take care. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Robert. And sorry again about that.
Take care. All the best.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.